Your country has just lost everything. Not just a battle, not just a war, an empire. The army that once terrified Europe is gone. Thousands of Swedish soldiers are dead. Thousands more are prisoners in Russia, and many of them will never see home again. Across Sweden, farms are missing the men who should have been working them. The treasury is exhausted. The country is buried in debt, and the empire that generations of Swedes have watched their kings build is disappearing from the map. And then your king dies. Not in a palace, not surrounded by his family, but in a muddy trench outside a fortress in Norway. And even now, we don't know for certain who fired the shot that killed him. So what do you do? Do you swear revenge? Do you rebuild the army? Do you find another warrior king, another Charles XII, another brilliant commander who promises that Sweden can become great again? Because that's what nations do often after disaster. They look backward. They remember what they lost. They convince themselves that if they just win one more war, one more battle, one more glorious victory, they can put everything back the way it was. But Sweden did something unexpected. It didn't immediately try to rebuild the empire. Instead, it began asking a much harder question. What if the old Sweden was gone? And if it was, what should come next? What followed was one of the most fascinating political experiments in Swedish history. A country that had spent generations concentrating power in the hands of its kings began taking that power away. A country that had measured greatness in armies and conquered territory began experimenting with parliament, commerce, science, and ideas. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't peaceful, and it certainly wasn't the end of Sweden's wars, but it changed the direction of the country. This is the story of the Age of Liberty, and the question I want you to keep in the back of your mind is this. Can a nation reinvent itself after losing an empire? Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. In episode 26, we watched the Swedish Empire collapse. We stood at Poltava as one of Europe's most formidable armies was destroyed. We followed Charles XII through exile and back to Sweden. And then we watched his story end outside of Fredrikstad Fortress. By 1721, the Swedish Empire was finished, and Sweden had a choice. It could spend the next generation trying to get it back, or it could accept the world had changed. That choice sounds simple when we say it now, but it wasn't, because Sweden wasn't just losing territory, it was losing identity. For nearly a century, Swedes had lived in a country that was a great European power. Their kings had conquered. Their armies had won battles that seemed almost impossible. Gustavus Adolphus had become a legend. Charles X Gustav had marched an army across the frozen Danish belts. Charles XII had defeated a Russian army several times his size at Narva. These weren't just stories about military victories. They were part of the story Sweden told itself about who it was. And then the story stopped working. The empire was gone. The army was exhausted. The treasury was nearly empty. And the people who had survived decades of war had to decide what came next. And that is where the Age of Liberty begins, not with some grand declaration that Sweden was going to become a modern democracy. It wasn't. And I don't want to make this period sound more enlightened or egalitarian than what it actually was. Power was still concentrated among the privileged estates. Politics could be corrupt. Foreign powers interfered. And eventually, Sweden would go to war again, but something fundamental had changed. The king was no longer going to be able to rule Sweden the way Charles XI and Charles XII had. Power was moving toward the Riksdag. Political factions would compete for influence. And for roughly half a century, Sweden would try something it had never really tried before. Could a country function without putting its fate in the hands of one powerful ruler? And perhaps even more importantly, could Sweden learn to be great without being an empire? That's the story we're going to tell. The story of Frihetstiden, the Age of Liberty. If you had walked through a Swedish village in 1721, you probably wouldn't need anyone to tell you that Sweden had lost the war. You could see it. Fields were waiting to be planted, but there weren't enough people left to work them. Workshops stood with empty benches. Church pews had familiar faces missing. And there were children growing up without fathers, some they may barely even remember. 21 years of war had taken a terrible toll, and the war hadn't stayed on the battlefields. It followed the people home. Sweden had fought Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, Lithuania, Russia again and again for more than 2 decades. And somehow, for a very long time, Sweden kept winning. That's the part of what makes the collapse so difficult to understand. This wasn't a country that spent generations expecting to lose, quite the opposite. Sweden had become accustomed to victory. Its kings had built an empire around the Baltic, its soldiers had earned a reputation across Europe, and its people had grown used to the idea Sweden was a great power, because that was simply what Sweden was. Then came Poltava. Then came the years of retreat and exhaustion, and finally, in 1721, peace. But peace didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The empire that Sweden had spent generations building was gone. The Baltic provinces were gone. Territories that had once made Sweden one of Europe's great powers were no longer Swedish. The treasury was nearly empty. The government was carrying enormous debts, and across the country, families were trying to rebuild their lives that decades of war had torn apart. But maps and money only tell part of the story. There was another loss, and you can't draw it on a map. Sweden had lost its sense of certainty. For generations, people had grown up believing that Sweden was one of the countries that mattered. Its kings had defeated larger armies. Its soldiers had marched into places where they had no business winning. Gustavus Adolphus, the march across the frozen belts, Narva. These weren't simply military victories. They had become part of Sweden's identity. The country had a story about itself. We are a great power. We are capable of extraordinary things. When Sweden goes to war, Sweden wins. And then Sweden went to war and lost. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What happens to a nation when the story it's been telling itself stops being true? Because that's a different kind of defeat. An army can be rebuilt, a treasury can eventually be replenished, territory can sometimes be recovered. But what do you do with a national identity that was built around something that no longer exists? Imagine sitting in the Riksdag at this moment. The king is dead, the empire is shrinking, the treasury is exhausted. The army that once inspired fear across Europe has been battered by decades of war. And you have to decide, what does Sweden do next? You have 2 obvious choices. You can look backward, try to rebuild the army, find another king who promises to restore Sweden's greatness, or you can look at everything that happened and decide that maybe the problem wasn't simply that Sweden had lost. Maybe the problem was with the way Sweden had been governing itself all along. Because if one king could lead the country into 21 years of war, what happens when you stop giving one king that much power? That was the question Sweden was about to answer, and the answer would change the country for decades to come. Sometimes the biggest revolutions don't begin with gunfire, they begin with a decision. In Sweden, that decision came after the death of Charles XII. He died without a son, and suddenly the country had another problem. Who would rule Sweden? His sister Ulrika Eleonora was prepared to take the throne. But there was a catch. The Swedish political elite had no intention of simply handing the new queen that kind of power that her brother possessed. If Ulrika Eleonora wanted the crown, she would have to accept a new set of rules. And those rules changed the balance of power in Sweden. Think about what was happening here. For generations, Swedish kings had accumulated enormous authority. Charles XI had strengthened the monarchy. Charles XII had inherited that power. And then it used it to wage war across Europe for most of his adult life. One man had been able to commit the country to years of warfare with very little ability for anyone else to stop him. Now Sweden had just experienced the consequences. So the people who were about to shape the new government were faced with a very simple question. Do we give the next king the same power? Their answer was no. And that decision is what makes the beginning of the Age of Liberty so remarkable. Sweden didn't overthrow its monarchy. It didn't abolish the crown. It didn't execute the royal family. Instead, it changed the rules. The king would remain the king, but he would no longer be able to govern Sweden as an absolute monarch. Power shifted toward the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, which represented the four estates of society: the nobility, the clergy, the burghers, and the free peasants. Now, before we get too excited and start calling this democracy, let's slow down. It wasn't. Most Swedes still had no direct political voice. Women had no vote. The political system heavily favored the privileged. And ordinary laborers weren't suddenly invited to the Riksdag to debate the future of the kingdom. This was not modern democracy, but it was something important. The king was no longer the unquestioned center of Swedish political life. For the first time in generations, the government would have to learn how to function through negotiation. And that sounds rather ordinary to us. Today, we're accustomed to governments arguing, parliaments disagree, parties form coalitions, bills get delayed, politicians complain about each other. Sometimes it feels like nothing gets done. But imagine living in a world where the normal assumption was the opposite. The king decides, everyone else obeys. That had been the political reality for much of Europe, and Sweden had just decided to try something else. Instead of one person holding the steering wheel, there would be several hands on it, which sounds like a terrible way to drive a carriage, but perhaps it was a better way to govern a country. And here's what I find most fascinating. The transformation didn't happen because some great philosopher announced that Sweden had discovered the perfect political system. It happened because Sweden had just lived through the consequences of giving one man enormous power. Charles XII wasn't necessarily a monster. He was brave, he was intelligent, he was an extraordinary military commander, and most of his soldiers loved him. But he also demonstrated something that Sweden would spend the next 50 years wrestling with. A brilliant ruler can still make disastrous decisions. And if the system gave that ruler too much power, the entire country goes along for the ride. So after Charles XII, Sweden decided that the next king shouldn't be able to do that. The monarchy would survive, but it would be constrained. The Riksdag would become more powerful, and the government would have to operate through something kings weren't particularly accustomed to. Other people saying no. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Because now Sweden had to learn how to govern itself without relying on a single powerful monarch. And someone was going to have to figure out how to make this new system actually work. That person was Arvid Horn. Horn had a very different idea of what Sweden needed to do next. He had served under Charles XII. He knew what the Swedish army was capable of. He also knew what 20 years of war had cost. So when the opportunity came to shape this new political system, he didn't use it to prepare Sweden for another campaign. He used it to keep Sweden out of one. And that sounds simple, and it wasn't. Because Sweden had spent generations treating military power as one of the foundations of national greatness. Horn was essentially asking the country to try something else: recovery. The treasury needed to recover. Trade needed to recover. Farmers needed to plant crops instead of marching to war. Families needed their sons at home. And perhaps most importantly, Sweden needed time. For nearly 2 decades, Horn worked toward that goal. Not great conquest, not glorious battlefield victory, no new provinces appearing on the map. Instead, Sweden slowly began pulling itself back together. Ships returned to Swedish ports carrying goods instead of soldiers. Fields that had been neglected were planted again. Government finances began to stabilize. And people who had spent years thinking about survival could finally begin thinking about something else: the future. It's easy to overlook periods like this when we study history. We're drawn toward the dramatic moments: battles, coups, assassinations, and great speeches. But there is nothing particularly dramatic about a farmer planting a field that his son might eventually inherit. There's nothing heroic about a government choosing not to start another war. And yet, those decisions can change the direction of a country. Horn understood that, but he was about to run into a problem that no political system can completely control: time, because time changes memory. The people who had lived through the Great Northern War were getting older. Their children were becoming adults. And eventually, there were people sitting in the Riksdag who knew the Swedish Empire primarily through stories. They had heard about Gustavus Adolphus. They had heard about Charles X Gustav marching across the frozen belts. They had heard about Narva. They had heard about Charles XII. But they hadn't experienced the things that made those stories less glorious. They hadn't watched a generation disappear. They hadn't waited for a son who never came home. They hadn't watched the treasury empty itself into another war. They inherited the victories without inheriting the memories of the cost. And that's when the question began to change. It wasn't, how do we survive? It became, why shouldn't Sweden be great again? And once that question entered Swedish politics, peace was no longer guaranteed. And I think that's where we're going to leave it at this part 1. Sweden has survived the collapse of its empire. It has changed the balance of power at home, and now a new generation is beginning to wonder whether Sweden should try to become a great power again. But what happens when that question turns into action? That's where we'll pick up in part 2. If you're enjoying the story, make sure you're following Beyond the Swedish Postcard. And if you know someone who would enjoy Swedish history or just enjoys history in general, share this episode with them. We'll continue the story next week. Until then, tack så mycket för att ni har lyssnat. Hej då for now. And as always, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard.